For many years, Burkina Faso was a country with no ocean around it in West Africa. They had a big problem that no one talked about much. The crops were ready to grow and people wanted to work, but the sky stopped giving them rain. In the middle of a place called Wit Province, there was an area called Bama that got hit the worst. The dirt was still good for growing things, but all the water disappeared. The government stopped caring, and the people just had to wait. Bama became a place everyone forgot about. The ground cracked open, the stores became empty, and young people left one bus ride at a time. But what the whole country didn't know was that this forgotten place would soon become a symbol of something much bigger. Even when the news stopped talking about it, people were still struggling, especially in the homes of families who stayed behind. In schools, kids learned about farming, but when they went home, they saw fields that their parents had given up on. When the rain came late or didn't come at all, it wasn't just the plants that died. People lost hope too. Families stopped believing things would get better. Years and years of knowing how to farm started to disappear. Some families left completely. Others stayed and lived off help from relatives or waited for food help that didn't always come when they needed it. The problem wasn't just in Bama. All across Burkina Faso, in other nearby countries in the Sahel, climate change made it harder to grow food every year. The rainy time got shorter and the dry time got longer. With each harvest that failed, Burkina Faso had to depend more and more on other countries. They had to depend on grain brought from far away, on help programs from distant countries, and on price changes caused by wars and droughts happening far from West Africa. In meetings in other countries, leaders talked about being independent, but in homes across Bama, people were carefully measuring their meals. One small bag of rice might need to last a whole week. Parents gave the best food to their kids. Neighbors shared whatever little they had. But just surviving wasn't the same as being stable, and it was hard to feel proud when the land itself seemed to have turned against them. It's hard to grow hope in dry dirt, but the people never stopped trying. Old water ditches were fixed with buckets and just their hands. Farmers tried planting early, growing crops in the dry season, and making natural fertilizer. Groups formed, often led by women, to find small ways to help each other. But without steady water, even the strongest efforts didn't work well. What Bama was missing wasn't people who wanted to work hard. It was the basic things they needed to succeed. For many years, that kind of investment only came with strings attached. Foreign workers, long waiting times, loans with tricky small print, and decisions made in offices far away from the communities they were supposed to help. So Bama stayed a name whispered in development plans but rarely helped. And yet it was here, in this forgotten place, that something would soon change. The change didn't come from a big world meeting. It didn't come from a new grant or a visit by people from other countries. It came from a decision made in the capital city, a decision that saw Bama not as a problem, but as a new beginning. Because what better place to start than the one that had been left behind the most? In early plans drawn up by President Traoré's government, the area around Bama began to show up on the map again. Not just as a number in a report, but as a place where something good could happen. The government's new plan for food security, jobs for young people, and not needing other countries needed somewhere to start. Bama, with its flat lands, its rich but unused soil, and its determined people, became the answer. And so before the first ditch was dug, before the first drop of canal water reached a rice field, something changed. People started talking again. Some came back home. Old tools were cleaned off. Hands that had been still began to move with purpose again. It would not be easy, but for the first time in years, Bama wasn't being asked to wait. It was being called to lead. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré came to power, the country was already under a lot of pressure. Security threats, money problems, and climate hardship had pushed Burkina Faso to a dangerous edge. But while many people expected him to focus on military stuff, more weapons, more borders, more force, Traoré turned towards something quieter, something more basic. He turned toward water, not just as something they needed, but as an answer to everything, an answer to hunger, to depending on others, to the cycle that had kept Burkina Faso waiting for help, for grain, for permission. For many years, international organizations had offered support, but it came with expectations. Long waiting times, experts brought in from outside, aid programs designed in distant cities, projects that promised to help, but often left local communities out of the planning. Traoré decided to take a different path. He looked at the land, at the farmers, at the empty canals that had been promised but never finished. And then he asked a simple question: why wait? Why wait for foreign loans when people needed help right now? Why wait for consultants when local engineers were ready to work? Why wait for approval from other countries when people were hungry now? In that moment, a new way of thinking was born, not written on paper, but put into action. Burkina Faso would build its own future with its own hands, on its own terms. The government found key farming areas that could do really well if water could be delivered regularly. One of the most promising was the area around something called the Suru Basin, a body of water with unused potential sitting just a few miles from the thirsty fields of Bama. The idea was bold. Redirect water from Suru through a new irrigation system. A canal long enough, strong enough, and smart enough to carry life directly to the farms that needed it most. And not over 10 years, not someday, in 8 months. That was the order. 8 months to design, dig, connect, and deliver. No consultants, no speeches, no ribbon cuttings with foreign partners. Just steel, soil, and determination from Burkina Faso to meet that goal. The government skipped traditional planning channels. Buying supplies was kept local. Oversight was given to trusted engineers, many of them young professionals who had never been given a national project before. What they didn't have in experience, they made up for in purpose. Traoré's message was clear. This isn't just infrastructure, it's a test of ability, a test of trust, a test of whether a country that had been pushed aside could, when given the chance, build without waiting for outside direction. Some people doubted it could be done. 8 months seemed impossible, especially without imported machines, outside funding, or technical help from major development partners. And if it failed even a little bit, it would have been used as proof by skeptics that Burkina Faso couldn't build alone. But inside the country, the mood was different. Something was changing. Cement mixers began to arrive at the work site before sunrise. Teams of welders, planners, and workers coordinated with urgency. Supply lines that were often slowed by red tape were tightened. Delays weren't allowed. Every wasted day was treated like a threat to the country's momentum. This was not just construction. It was coordination. It was discipline. It was belief. For many of the workers, it was also the first time they felt the government's investment reach them directly. Not as aid, not as charity, but as jobs. The Bama Canal wasn't just about water anymore. It was about ownership, about proving that even in a country under sanctions and strain, progress could still flow. Not from the outside, but from within. And so with no international loans, with no foreign flags waving at the groundbreaking, and with nothing but urgency and national will behind it, they didn't begin with blueprints printed in Europe. They began with a shovel in the soil. From the banks of the Suru Basin, machines moved slowly at first, carving a new path across the land that had waited far too long. The water had always been there, the people too. What was missing was the connection. And now that connection had a name, the Bama Canal. It wasn't just a ditch. It was a promise from one region to another, from one generation to the next. A promise that this time, something real would flow. Stretching across the heart of Haué province, the Bama Canal was designed to carry life to the very fields that had once cracked open under heat and hunger. And it was no small effort. The project would serve 1,160 hectares of rice fields and an additional 70 hectares of vegetables, with over 200 hectares more already marked for expansion. These were not just numbers. They were fields waiting to come back to life. Patches of land that had once been silent, now ready to grow. But it wasn't just about how much land, it was how it was being done. No foreign contractors, no borrowed machinery, no advisors flown in for photo sessions and policy talks. This canal was being built by Burkina Faso engineers, Burkina Faso welders, Burkina Faso workers, people who knew the land not from reports but from memory, who didn't need translators to understand the urgency, who had walked these fields as children and now returned as builders. Day and night, the work continued. Cement mixers roared before sunrise. Steel was measured and welded under floodlights. The hum of activity became the soundtrack of a region rising. To meet the 8-month deadline set by the president, the site operated like a living thing. Every crew had its job. Every delay was fixed immediately. Officials visited not for ceremonies but for coordination. The entire operation moved with one goal in mind: bring the water. And not just any water. Water delivered with precision, with pressure, with sustainability. This is why along the canal's length, teams installed solar-powered irrigation pumps, pressure control valves, and began testing smart monitoring systems. Tools to make sure that every drop was counted, that nothing was wasted, that this wouldn't just be a project for today, but a system built for tomorrow. The idea was clear. No more broken pipes, no more outdated systems handed down from donors who would never use them. This would be Africa's most modern community-built irrigation canal, and it would be owned by the people who lived around it. Along the banks, something else began to rise. Storage warehouses where grains could be kept after harvest, access roads connecting farms to local markets, water hubs placed not for show, but for need. Placed where the crops lived, not where cameras pointed. And behind every structure was a name, a face, a worker who now had a reason to stay in Bama. One by one, abandoned tools were picked up again. One by one, farmers returned to test the new water lines. And slowly, the sound of uncertainty, the kind that had hung over the region like a cloud, began to fade. Because now the canal was real. Not a promise in a plan, not a line in a speech, but a channel carved by hand, wide enough to carry food, income, and confidence across a region once forgotten. And while the water had only just begun to flow, what was rising alongside it was far more powerful: hope. The canal may have begun with water, but it was built with people. Before the first harvest, before a single vegetable reached the market, it was hands and sweat that shaped the future. And those hands weren't foreign. They weren't imported from abroad. They belonged to Burkina Faso welders, masons, engineers, planners, and youth who had once been told they had no place in big projects. On the edges of the canal, machines moved like clockwork, but the real power came from the men and women guiding them. Over 2,000 jobs were created directly through the Bama Canal. Every job came with more than a paycheck. It came with a sense of purpose. In most large infrastructure projects across Africa, the story's different. Outside companies win the contracts, workers arrive from far away, locals are often hired only to carry, dig, or clean. If this canal followed that same script, disconnected and delayed, it would have become just another forgotten promise. But here, that pattern was broken. Traoré's government threw out the old playbook. They built the project on a local buying model, meaning almost everything was bought from inside the country. The cement from local suppliers, the steel from regional workshops, the transport managed by Burkina Faso logistics teams. Even the tools, when broken, were fixed nearby, not shipped overseas for parts. This wasn't just a job site, it was a national circulation system, pumping income, skills, and confidence across Ué province and beyond. Inside the canal zone, the buzz of welding torches meant irrigation gates were being sealed. The clang of stone against steel embankments meant the canal's walls were holding. The hum of solar panels being installed meant smart pumps were almost ready. And through it all, the workforce grew. Many of them were young. Some had never had formal jobs before. Some had left cities like Ouagadougou in search of opportunity and found it not in an office but beside the canal. The government didn't just hire workers, they also opened training centers near the canal, offering quick courses in canal maintenance, solar irrigation systems, hydraulics, logistics, agricultural tech. What began as temporary labor was becoming a long-term workforce, skilled, professional, and rooted in the country's future. And as jobs increased, something else began to slow: rural to urban migration. For years, young people had left places like Bama, convinced there was no future in agriculture. But now they were staying, not because they were stuck, but because they could see something growing under their feet. The impact stretched beyond the canal. Local businesses, from food vendors to hardware shops, began to feel the shift. Money was circulating, spending was local, confidence was returning. In the eyes of many workers, this wasn't just about irrigation. It was about inclusion. It was about finally being part of a project that wasn't designed elsewhere, one they could point to and say, "We built that." And that phrase, "we built that," echoed far beyond construction. It reached into homes, it reached into classrooms, it reached into the future. Because when people believe they can build, they begin to build everything differently, from careers to communities. And at the heart of that belief, running steady between fields and workshops, was the canal. A channel of water, but also a channel of work, knowledge, and national dignity. Before the water arrived, the land in Bama waited in silence. Now it breathes again. With every drop that moves through the canal, something changes. Not just in the soil, but in the people. What was once dry and forgotten has begun to grow. And what is growing is more than crops. It's confidence. It's control. Burkina Faso is feeding itself again. From the 1,260 hectares of rice fields to the 70 hectares of vegetables, the canal is doing what speeches and plans alone could never do. It is producing food. Real food in real time. Early estimates already show the country is on track to produce an extra 50,000 tons of food per year from this region alone. That means fewer imports, fewer emergency grain shipments, and fewer sleepless nights for families wondering how to stretch a single meal. It also means lower food prices. Local rice is now competing with imported varieties. Vegetables that once came from across borders are now being sold just miles from where they were grown. For markets across Burkina Faso, the difference is clear. The shelves are fuller, the food is fresher, and the money stays inside the country. But even more important than the numbers is the feeling. Because for many in Bama, this isn't just a farming story, it's a return. A return to land their families once left. A return to traditions that were nearly lost. A return to being in charge of what they eat and when. Farmers who had once watched their fields go dry are now preparing for second harvests. Women's cooperatives that were once limited to dry season planting now have year-round water. Youth who once dreamed only of leaving the village are starting small agribusinesses. Some focus on rice, others on tomatoes, peppers, or onions. For the first time in years, farming feels like a path forward, not just a way to survive. And the impact isn't just in the fields. The entire economy is responding. As food supply increases, food inflation begins to slow. Families are spending less on rice and more on education, healthcare, and small businesses. Local seed banks are expanding, crop diversity is growing, and the value of land in and around Bama has quietly begun to rise. But the most important shift is one you can't always measure in tons or money. It's the shift in mindset. Because when a nation can feed itself, it stands taller, it speaks differently, it negotiates differently. For too long, Burkina Faso's food system was shaped by what others could offer or withhold. Grain prices abroad, export bans, shipping delays, each one caused tremors at home. But with the Bama Canal flowing, those tremors are weaker. Burkina Faso is no longer waiting at the back of the line when global supplies tighten. It's building its own supply on its own terms, in its own soil. This is more than self-reliance. It's what many now call food sovereignty. The right to decide what your people eat, when, and how without being told. It means local diets are respected. It means food comes without conditions. It means that the next drought or the next global shock won't undo years of progress overnight. And it all begins with water, not falling from the sky, but flowing through a canal built by Burkina Faso for Burkina Faso. In the fields of Bama, you can already hear the difference. Laughter at harvest, wheels turning at mills, vendors shouting prices with pride, children walking past green rows of food their parents planted and now prepare to harvest again. This is what power looks like, not in loud declarations, but in quiet, steady growth. At first glance, it looks like a canal, a stretch of earth carved through the plains of Bama, carrying water from the Suru Basin to farms that had once gone dry. Concrete walls, steel gates, solar pumps. It is infrastructure, solid, visible, measurable. But ask the people who built it and they'll tell you it's something more. They'll tell you it's a turning point. Because behind every trench, every pipe, and every flow of water, there's a message. Burkina Faso can build for itself. For generations, development was something that happened to Africa, not with it. Decisions came from outside. Funding came with conditions. Projects often arrived late or never arrived at all. But the Bama Canal broke that pattern. This wasn't a donation. It wasn't a pilot test from a foreign agency. It wasn't designed in Paris, approved in Washington, or signed off in Brussels. It was planned in Ouagadougou, built in Bama, owned by the people who will use it. Every cement slab carries the weight of a new kind of thinking, one that says progress doesn't have to wait for permission. President Traoré didn't just set a goal, he set a standard. 8 months, no excuses, no outsourcing, and most importantly, no shortcuts that would leave the people behind. The canal was delivered on time, but what it delivered was far more than water. It delivered trust. Trust that the government could move quickly. Trust that young people didn't have to leave to find work. Trust that the land could still give life if given the chance. For many in Burkina Faso, that trust had been missing for a long time. Promises had come and gone, poverty had lingered, and belief in national development had faded, replaced by survival and silence. But here in Bama, something shifted. Because this time, the promise arrived with action. The trench was dug, the water flowed, and the food began to grow. Now that same belief is spreading to nearby villages watching their neighbors grow 2 harvests instead of 1, to local governments asking how they can copy the model, to farmers who now plan for the long term, not just the next rainy season. Even vocational schools are changing. Training programs in solar irrigation, canal maintenance, logistics, and agricultural tech are now considered real career paths. Young people are studying how to operate, not just observe. And that's the deeper shift. Because when infrastructure is truly local, it doesn't just build roads or canals. It builds citizens who see themselves as capable of shaping their own future. What began as a trench is becoming a template, not just for Burkina Faso, but for the region. A template that says, you don't need to borrow to build, you don't need to wait to grow, you don't need permission to feed your people. And in a time when many African countries are still struggling with debt, food insecurity, and foreign reliance, that message is powerful. It's not about rejecting the world. It's about standing on your own feet when you can. The Bama Canal did not solve every problem. It didn't erase poverty overnight, but it did prove something vital, that change is possible, and that when it starts from within, from the land, the people, the will, it holds. So today, when you walk along the edge of that canal, you're not just seeing water, you're seeing sovereignty in motion, one drop at a time.